My mother humiliated me at my graduation. She stood up in the middle of the auditorium when my name had just been called and shouted that everything I had achieved was a lie, that my thesis was plagiarized, that I had only finished because of people who had done the work for me, that I'd wasted the family's time and money. She called me a fraud with my friends within earshot. She told strangers I was ungrateful and that I owed her for the life she had built around me. It hurt because she was right there where people I respected were applauding, because my father and my oldest friend were in the front row and had to see it. It hurt because she used the only place that made me legitimately mine. That stage, that tassel, the small ribbon my advisor had pinned on my robe, and turned it into a spectacle about her. It hurt because she did it with a calmness that felt planned, as if she had measured how many heads would swivel and how many phones would lift. I didn't expect confrontation that day. I had expected my mother to cry, to hug me, maybe to tell the same tired jokes she always told about my study habits. She had been quietly difficult for years, but graduation had been one thing I had convinced myself would belong only to me. I was 31, finishing the PhD that had been 6 years in the making. I had scholarships, assistantships, a fellowship that covered living expenses, none of which I would have expected my mother to pillory publicly. The year before, I had moved back into her house because my lease ended and I couldn't afford to renew on the stipend I had as a visiting researcher. It was a small house 2 towns over from campus, with a sagging porch step and a garden my mother tended like a slow religion. She paid for my car repairs for the last 2 years because I had deferred larger paychecks for payback to the department. She paid my phone bill when my bank account ran thin. I took it. I resented it sometimes. I liked the quiet house. It saved me 2 hours of commuting a day. I liked not counting every grocery item. I had told myself the dependency was temporary, and I had promised myself I would be independent again once I had the degree finished and the job offers. The grant applications were lined up. The power imbalance was always obvious. My mother had been the primary earner when I was young, the one open to negotiation with the family bank, the one who had a voice when things went wrong. She had always been loud in ways I didn't want to match, and softer in all the places where I wanted kindness. When I was 19, after my father left, she locked our bank boxes and said she would handle the money. She signed documents for me, co-signed loans, and later insisted that because she had taken the risk by covering my emergency tuition once, she deserved to be consulted on major decisions. That phrase, major decisions, had metastasized. It came up when I wanted to apply for a particular fellowship, when I wanted to list myself as lead on a conference poster, when I wanted to speak to donors. She told relatives that I was flighty if I didn't run choices by her. When I decided to pursue my research full-time, at some point the grant proposals became less of an academic exercise and more of a ledger in her head. She began to count in future tense the money that could come as the house to be sold, the niece who could be paid for college. She would remark, half joking, that when I had real funding, we'd finally buy new gutters and stop arguing about whose turn it was to shovel the walk. Behind the jokes, she built a ledger of expectations. I was the benefactor hope. I could feel the weight of it in small humiliations. The sideways glances when I refused to tell her the title of a grant before contracts were signed. The sharp comment when I held back an email from my department because it contained sensitive internal reviews. She began to think of my success as a trophy she had a right to polish. After the graduation humiliation, the first escalation felt almost inevitable. The week before the ceremony, she had been distant. She had helped me pick my robe and had said nothing about sentiment. Then, sitting in the pew afterward and watching people leave with their degrees and bouquets, she refused to walk out with me at first. She said she needed to speak to the dean. A half hour later, she marched back in and planted herself in the aisle like someone staking a claim. The dean, a lean man with a voice that boomed in audit rooms, chose not to stop her at first. He was used to campus theatrics. He assumed it would be the same old domestic argument, a bitter word about money, a ruined speech, and then closure. He underestimated the way my mother could turn a private grudge public. When she rose and started shouting, when she called names and accused me of fraud, people turned. Phones out, comments muttered. My professor put a hand to his face. My dad looked like he'd been punched. My reaction then was tightness and surprise. I stood rooted, cap in hand, cheeks hot in a way that felt impossible to control. I wanted to go to her, to pull her under my arm and make the stupid small joke we always made when my face went red, but there was a crowd. She had succeeded in making me a target, and part of me, the smaller part, froze because she had rehearsed a humiliation exact enough that I could not finish thinking my own thoughts. When someone in the back laughed and someone else hissed, the sound spread. I remember the smell of flowers and cologne and the cold metal under my fingers. I remember the dean stepping forward and the campus security moving in like a slow tide. After, when it was quieter and the auditorium was a line of robes and damp applause, the dean took me aside. He did not make a spectacle. He said in a way that was firm but not unkind, that we would handle it later, that there were protocols for accusations and for hearing complaints, and that the security report would be filed. He said he was sorry it had happened. He did not tell me then that he had been working on something specific, the grant award letter in his inbox. Instead, the escalation loops continued at home. My mother doubled down. She started making calls, a wave of gossip that felt methodical. She called my aunt, who had always been on her side. She called a woman in my high school who had since married into money and ran a small private foundation. She messaged the alumni page of my class and wrote in a private thread that I had manufactured achievements. She called the department chair and left a terse voicemail accusing me of fabricating results and named people I had collaborated with, as if she had access to my CV and my work. It was a mess of names and insinuations without evidence. The insinuations hurt because some people are lazy with trust and believe the familiar voice of the family member rather than the stranger scientist. Inside the house, the temperature changed. She began to go through my mail in late afternoons when I was in the lab. I found letters she had opened stacked on my dresser, some addressed to the research lab, some from foundations. She would ask about donor letters, as if they were common household bills, and she had the right to cross them out. She started talking about how much the house would be worth if we sold it, and how she had given up so much for me and my pointless theories. She told friends that she had kept me afloat and that I owed her and that she was tired. And I reacted by trying to set boundaries that slid right off her skin. I sat her down at the kitchen table and said plainly that I needed space, that I was hurt by what she had done in public, that she had no right to speak for my work. She listened, head tilted, and then said her truth, that she had been ignored in the past and that she would not be silent now. The conversation dissolved. The consequence was immediate. She began to restrict my access to the car she had insisted on letting me use. She called the insurance company and transferred the registration into her name. She claimed that if she had to sign for everything, she at least wanted the legal cover. At the department, the gossip metastasized. A doctoral student from another lab who had once been kind to me started leaving me out of group coffee runs. An assistant in the dean's office stopped greeting me in the hallway. My advisor kept his distance for a week, wrapped up in official duties and damage control. Someone from outside the department sent a private message asking if I was really the author of a draft they had seen online. They had seen it because a link had been posted anonymously on social media. I spent nights composing emails I never sent. My work, which should have been an anchor of facts, became a living thing subject to rumor. The next escalation involved money. My mother told me she would withhold groceries if I did not clear the air with the family. She would pay for the car gas, but not for anything else. She began saying that she had been the one to help me get the student loan for my fieldwork 5 years ago, and that she expected I would repay her directly, and in access and obedience. She insisted I sign a document she had printed, a short page stating that I would consult her on any financial windfalls. When I refused to sign, she placed the paper on my desk and said flatly that if I wanted access to the house's internet, she would control it, and that until I showed proper respect, she would manage my emails. My reaction was practical. I moved sensitive correspondence to a private email and changed passwords. I started forwarding only necessary things to my mother. That small act of digital privacy escalated the situation. She found a way into my phone by guessing answers to security questions, my mother's name, the street where we had lived, and then called my advisor, complaining that I had cut her out. It was a flood of small invasions that left me raw. I felt violated in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not only was my reputation being challenged in public, but my private lines of communication were being policed. Consequences multiplied. Departmental funding that supported my stipend arrived late because of administrative confusion, and my mother used that delay as proof that my career was unstable. She began bringing people over at odd hours. Distant cousins who asked me for ponies facts about my research and then leaned into commentary about my temperament. I stopped inviting people to the house. I began staying in the lab late at night, watching the lights turn off one by one and feeling like a visitor. The pressure calibrated to a new level when she threatened the one thing she thought she could wield with real force. Our family home and, by extension, the quiet place I had been living. "You are welcome to your room," she said in a conversation that ended in a slammed door. But this house is mine and I will invite who I please." She gave me an ultimatum that I must publicly apologize to relatives and accept that I had exaggerated my role in the lab if I wanted to stay. She promised, with an ugly smile, to make arrangements if I chose otherwise. The implied consequence was eviction. I had no money saved. My stipend barely covered rent in town, and the idea of a sudden need to move with deadlines for the semester, a cohort to finish with, felt like a collapse. I tried to talk to the graduate union, They were sympathetic but slow, cataloging complaints and saying they would advise. I told them I was worried about retribution from my mother if I filed anything formal. They recommended housing resources and legal clinics. The legal clinic suggested a tenant rights workshop, but that required a time commitment and a walk across town, and each obligation was a small fissure in time I could not afford. Every attempt to protect myself seemed to be met with a new squeeze. Then there were the social escalations. My mother began to reach for public allies. She befriended a parent from my childhood neighborhood, a man who ran a local Facebook page, and together they wrote a post titled "A Cautionary Tale" that used my graduation incident as its hook. They praised my mother's fortitude and implied my betrayal as a moral lesson for the town. The post gained traction. A neighborhood message board flagged it. A reporter from a small local paper called and left a message asking for comment about the family dispute during graduation. My reaction there was to retreat. I did not want headlines, and I did not want a narrative shaped by my mother's anger. I began to accept invitations less, to say I had meetings to build the illusion of a life that was separate and steady. But the more I tried to keep a low profile, the louder she got, because quiet made her feel invisible. She had always measured value in the size of a public thing. Appearances, plaques, weddings, funerals. When I refused to make my life a public transaction, she treated me like a missing exhibit. The next escalation occurred within the lab itself. The foundation I had applied to, a private philanthropic body that funds early career researchers, had a review timeline that was slow and secretive. I had quietly submitted an application for a particular fellowship meant to support independent work, one that, if awarded, would allow me to hire a technician and cover lab costs directly under my name. I had kept it quiet because the foundation required that letters not be public until award day. My mother, not one for waiting, had found an old draft of that application on my laptop and assumed the worst. She told the neighbors at a barbecue that I was sitting on a pile of cash and that the town should prepare for our family's prosperity. That rumor reached the foundation by way of someone I did not want to alert. Once a rumor gets traction, institutions get nervous. The foundation staff started asking questions about whether I had disclosed all affiliations and whether my application had family support. My mother, thinking she had leverage, tried to call them. She sent a blunt email asking to be recognized as a co-signer on future decisions because she had sacrificed. The foundation politely declined to discuss technical review matters with third parties and asked that all applicants communicate directly. The people at the foundation were polite, but the process became slower, and the secrecy around an award that had been in review became a rupture. For months, my life became a series of small losers. Invitations were rescinded. A promising collaboration with a nearby biomedical lab stalled because the PI was hesitant to commit without clarity about my funding sources. A colleague who had been enthusiastic began to hedge public support. My mother, emboldened, began to tell people that I had bragged about soon-to-come money like it was theft. And I started to believe that maybe the foundation would think twice about trusting an applicant from a family that behaved like a hostage situation. I feared the worst, that someone else's misreading might cost me what I had worked toward. Financial pressure compounded. My mother called the bank pretending to be me and asked about my accounts, then later told me she knew where I spent my money and that she would reimburse me for groceries and cash if I behaved. She began to show up at the lab unannounced, asking for updates about the project she had never understood and leaving notes on my bench. "You promised." One note said, "Remember, if this fails, I've been the one who called the shots," as if she could force my career to grind to a halt by sheer persistence. Then came the low point. It wasn't one public collapse. It was a small, private thing that felt like the loss of leverage you didn't know you had. I lost access to the lab's shared account for ordering supplies because my advisor, under pressure from an anonymous message that claimed I had diverted funds, temporarily suspended my purchasing privileges. It was a simple administrative function, but without it, I couldn't order reagents for an experiment scheduled for the next week. The suspension came with a formal notice to submit documentation, and the notice used bureaucratic language that sounded terrifying. It suggested an inquiry. My advisor said he couldn't lend me his account to place the order. He said it was a liability. That night at the kitchen table, I felt something thin and dangerous slide through me. The house smelled of coffee and lavender. My mother sat across from me and said quietly, "Maybe it's for the best. Maybe you'll learn that we can't fix everything with money." It was a line meant to be wise, but it landed like an accusation. I had lost access to the one thing that was actual leverage in my life, the ability to do my work. Without experiments, there were no papers, no evidence of competence. Without evidence, the rumor would be more credible. Without the ability to buy reagents, my timeline slipped, and grant reviewers would want to know why. I felt trapped in a way I had not before. I was exhausted, alone, and facing the possibility that an administrative pause would cascade into something larger. Reviews delayed, recommendations withheld, the very thing that justified years of sacrifice evaporating. The quiet loss of access, not a dramatic firing, but a bureaucratic hiccup lodged with the right language, felt like the most accurate form of defeat. It wasn't drama, it was slow. Then something shifted, not because of a speech or a raid, but because of a document that arrived in the dean's email, a finalized award letter from the foundation. It came as a PDF with the sort of administrative brevity that is almost itself a kind of applause. It named me as the recipient of a multi-year research fellowship. It specified the amount, $1 million over a 5-year period. And it listed the obligations and the rights that came with it. It named me as the principal investigator, responsible for the funds and for hiring. It listed the dean as a contact and asked the university to sign necessary institutional assurances. The dean had been sitting on the news, waiting for the right moment to inform the university, because foundations sometimes ask for confidentiality until contracts are finalized. He had the letter queued for a formal announcement to the school and to donors. He had not wanted to complicate the graduation day itself. But then my mother stood up in front of everyone and accused me of fraud. The dean realized that letting the accusation hang in the air would be a risk to the student's reputation and to the institution. He decided to act quickly. He did not want to make a show. He did not want to humiliate someone else for the sake of my relief. He asked security to clear a small space and walked to the microphone that had been left on the podium after the ceremony. His voice was quiet enough that only a section of the audience heard it first. He said he had an official announcement that his office had received notice of a substantial fellowship, and then he read the letter. He said the foundation had awarded a 5-year research fellowship in my name, that the funds were to support my project on urban environmental resilience, and that the university would implement the agreement. He said the amount plainly as if numbers could be a salve, $1 million. The change that came in the room was immediate. Phones came up again. My mother, who had been in the aisle ready to continue, stopped and looked like someone who had been struck. Her face did not show regret, it showed recalculation. For the first time in months, something outside her control had entered the conversation. The dean did not shout. He did not accuse her of anything, and he simply held up a document and spoke the truth the document contained. That document was the turning point. It meant that I was no longer simply subject to the narrow leverage that familial control affords. The grant named me the PI, which gave me institutional backing and a budget controlled through the university's research office. It meant there was money to hire help, to secure the lab space we needed, and to ensure that I would not lose access to essential supplies because of an administrative hiccup. More importantly, it meant I had a legal claim to business decisions going forward. My mother could not sign for me on matters that required my signature as the principal investigator. The university's contracts office would require institutional assurances and clear signatories. They would not accept a private individual's claim. I remember sitting there, cap still askew, and feeling a slow, almost mechanical exhale. Around me, people I knew were murmuring, some with congratulations, some with curiosity about the foundation. The dean handed me a printed copy of the award letter. I read it under the press of 100 eyes and felt how real a piece of paper could become. My mother made a small noise, like a person realizing a chess move had turned against them. The aftermath was not immediate redemption. Power dynamics do not flip overnight. My mother called me that evening and said, through a voice taut and thin, that the grant didn't change, that she had been right about my character. She suggested we keep things private and that I honor her in future decisions. I did not explode. I told her simply, and that I would abide by legal obligations and that the university would handle research administration. I did not say the words that would cut, that she had no legal say in how the funds were spent. The dean's letter would do the legal clarifying for me. The consequences of the turning point were concrete and slow. The university's research office took over the administrative side. They assigned a grants manager, a line item budget, and a compliance officer. They restored my purchasing privileges. They asked for a project timeline and for hiring proposals. They also required me, as a condition of the award, to commit to university policies and to periodic reporting. Suddenly, I had obligations that tied me to the institution in another way. But this time, the obligations were mine to fulfill, not someone else's. My mother shifted tactics. She could not claim the grant or the lab. The paperwork would not allow that. Instead, she began to argue for recognition in different arenas. She wanted to be listed in acknowledgements. She wanted credit for raising me. She wanted to be invited to donor events. She wrote congratulatory notes and copied in the alumni office. The university, cautious, set boundaries. They allowed private attendance at public events, but would not place her name on any funding documents. The development office extended an invitation to a donor appreciation event as a courtesy, but they made clear that the award was to support my research under my leadership. The relationship did not repair itself through paperwork. My mother and I negotiated new, brittle boundaries. I moved out of the house 2 months later into a small apartment closer to campus. Not out of spite, but because managing the daily friction had become a cost I could no longer afford emotionally. The move was painful. I left behind the porch swing, the garden she had coaxed into being, and the easy inertia of a house where nothing else demanded decision-making. I took with me boxes of lab notebooks, a few books, and a ceramic bowl she had once made for me when I was 14 and had declared an interest in ceramics for a day. She did not come to help pack. The logical consequences played out. I could hire a technician who could run experiments and order supplies. The grant money allowed me to secure a small lab space and to put in a request for specialized equipment. With those resources, the manuscripts I'd been working on began to shape up into publishable drafts. Collaborations that had stalled finally moved forward because PIs wanted to partner with a funded investigator. The university's compliance office made it clear that any accusations about misconduct would have to be documented and investigated formally. Anonymous claims would not simply remove the rights of a funded investigator. That meant my mother could rage and post, but she could not erase the legal reality of the award. There were relational consequences as well. My father, who had been present at graduation, but silent in private matters for years, called more often. He avoided taking sides explicitly, but his presence on the phone offered a kind of shore. My aunt stopped attending family meetings where accusations took wing. And friends who had been quiet now reached out with notes of support. It was not restoration, it was a rearrangement. The worst consequences, the ones that left a ringing hollow for a while, were the quieter personal losses. My mother and I had traded years of intimacy for a ledger of obligations. Some holidays became tense. Invitations were given and rescinded. There were relatives who whispered that I had been difficult. I did not get to have the idealized reconciliation where everything was forgiven because the money proved me right. Instead, I had to live with the fact that, despite the award, the relationship was fractured in ways that would not be repaired by funding alone. Over the next year, the grant did what grants are supposed to do. It bought time and capacity. I published 2 papers. I hired a technician who had the steady hands I did not, and we started to see real results that matched up with the proposal. The foundation came to a site visit, and people who had once been skeptical now saw the data and the lab notebooks. The dean, whose intervention had been quiet but decisive, told me once in a hallway that he was glad we had the papers to support the award and that he regretted how things had played out. He did not apologize for acting. He watched the institutional edges and made the call that protected a student. My mother continued to call. Sometimes we spoke for minutes, other times for a single curt exchange. She wanted to be thanked publicly. I refused to stage anything for her. I could not offer the apology she wanted because to do so would have been to capitulate to a narrative she had already spun. Instead, I offered, whenever we spoke, clear facts, updates on the work, names when she asked, times for visits if she behaved with respect. Boundaries were small rituals, a password change, a calendar invite, an email copy to the grants manager when she asked for details. The emotional arc of the year was not dramatic in the telos sense. There was no cinematic ending where everyone forgave each other on the lawn. There was, instead, a slow rebalancing. The grant allowed me to breathe, to build a team, and to feel the legal certainty that someone else's name could not override my professional agency. It also made the cost of my mother's humiliation measurable in a way it had not been before. A year of anxiety, lost sleep, and a small catalogue of resentments. Those damages did not disappear. They receded because I had space to rebuild. But at the end of it all, I learned, if learning is the soft, patient thing that happens after events, that power is often quietly distributed through documents and institutional processes. That piece of paper, the award letter, changed what was possible in a way that anger and shame could not. It did not make my mother's words vanish. It simply reframed them. It made certain actions impossible for her to execute and opened possibilities for me to act decisively. My life after the award was different practically and emotionally. I had meetings with the grants office, a budget review, and a technician's paycheck to sign. I wrote emails that were not apologies. I hired a mediator once to work through some of the family disputes so that holiday dinners could be functional, if not affectionate. So we set a rule: politics of the lab, stay out of family dinners. Sometimes we kept it, sometimes we didn't. The fractures remained. I accepted that. Now, when I look back at the podium and that moment when my mother shouted, "The memory is sharp but not dominant." I remember the dean's hand on the microphone and the small white paper that leveled the room. I remember the way the grant letter smelled like fresh ink and the quiet way it made the university stand behind me. I also remember the nights of worry that preceded it and the slow repairs afterward. The story is not a victory lap. It is a messy ledger of what it costs to be both a daughter and a professional with real claims. There are days when I think of the bowl she made that I took with me when I moved. It is imperfect. The glaze has a hairline crack. I keep it on my desk and sometimes put pens in it. It is both a memory and a practical object. I haven't repaired the crack. The bowl works. The crack is part of its history, but it does not ruin the bowl's function. If anything, the past few years taught me to pay attention to the quiet instruments of power, paperwork, institutional backing, the way a title and a signature can protect or expose you. They taught me to be cautious about transparency with relatives who are more eager to claim than to support, and they taught me to keep a clear line between family obligations and institutional obligations. I speak about it now because the story sometimes helps students who feel trapped by relatives who confuse help with control. I do not offer platitudes. I offer details. Keep copies of your applications, password protect your accounts, and keep legal counsel close to hand if domestic pressure becomes administrative interference. I do not expect everyone to be saved by a letter from a foundation. That letter was an unusual stroke of luck. It was also the result of years of work, rewrites, and nights when I chose to be in the lab instead of answering holiday calls. If you stayed until the end of this video and my long confession about power and family felt useful, please leave a like. It helps these conversations reach other people who might be holding their breath. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. And if you've been in a similar position or have a thought about family boundaries and careers, leave a comment. I'd like to know what you did.